Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the most scandalous bedchambers of European history. Picture this. While today's celebrities make headlines for dating 3 people in a year, there was once a Saxon prince who allegedly fathered 365 children, according to historical chronicles from Dresden's royal archives. That's literally 1 child for every single day of the year. And another royal, Britain's Prince Regent George IV, spent over £630,000 on his mistresses and lavish parties. That's equivalent to $50 million today, according to Bank of England inflation records. These aren't fairy tales, my friends. These are the true stories of Europe's most promiscuous princes, men whose appetites for pleasure were so legendary that they literally rewrote history. Some started wars over their affairs. Others created entire new religions just to divorce their wives. And one prince's forbidden love story accidentally triggered World War I, killing 16 million people. You know, before we dive into these incredible tales together, I'd love it if you could show some love to this channel. Hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying these historical bedtime stories, and maybe give this video a like, but only if it genuinely entertains you. I'm curious too, where are you watching from tonight? Are you cozy in bed in Texas, maybe listening while it's snowing in Minnesota, or perhaps you're having a midnight snack in Florida? Drop a comment and let me know your location. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable with that warm blanket, and let's explore these royal secrets together. So why were European princes historically so much more adventurous than today's celebrities? There are 3 shocking reasons most people never realize. First, absolute power was literally the ultimate drug. When you're told from birth that God personally chose you to rule, your brain actually changes. Modern neuroscience shows that even small amounts of power reduce empathy and increase impulsive behavior. These princes had the power of life and death over millions. Louis XIV of France literally said, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. When you believe you are the country, every person in it feels like your property. Second, they were trapped in loveless arranged marriages. Most met their wives for the first time at the altar, often women who didn't even speak their language. Marriage was about politics, not love. Seeking real connection elsewhere wasn't just understandable, it was almost inevitable. Third, and this might shock you, infidelity was actually expected. Many European courts had official positions called maîtresse en titre, literally titled mistress, with their own palace apartments and royal salaries. It was so normalized that some queens actually helped choose their husbands' girlfriends because it kept the king happy and politically manageable. But here's what makes our princes special. They are so excessive that they shocked even these permissive societies. We're talking about rulers who bankrupted kingdoms for love, who built entire cities as playgrounds, who changed world religions for bedroom access. Tonight, you'll discover how Henry V's serial marriages didn't just break England from Rome, they created the foundation for America's religious freedom. You'll learn why one German prince's stamina became such a European sensation that mathematicians actually calculated whether 365 children was biologically possible, and you'll hear how a shy Austrian crown prince's secret affair accidentally created the spark that exploded into the 20th century's first global catastrophe. These aren't just scandalous bedtime stories. They're windows into power, psychology, and the very human consequences when absolute authority meets unlimited desire. Some tales will make you laugh at royal audacity. Others might make you surprisingly sympathetic to these lonely, powerful men. And a few will genuinely change how you think about love and human nature. But we start with the king who literally rewrote Christianity for his libido. Henry VIII wasn't just famous for his 6 wives. Historical records from the Vatican archives reveal he had dozens of secret mistresses, spent fortunes on love gifts, and created diplomatic crises across Europe with his romantic chaos. His bedroom decisions didn't just change England, they shaped the entire Protestant Reformation. And here's something that'll blow your mind. After we explore Henry's religious revolution for romance, you'll meet Louis XIV of France, the Sun King who was so obsessed with impressing his mistresses that he built the most expensive palace in human history. Versailles wasn't just a royal residence, according to court memoirs discovered in 1890. It was essentially the world's most elaborate love nest, designed specifically to seduce the most beautiful women in Europe. But Louis's 22 official mistresses were just the beginning of a story so outrageous, it makes modern celebrity scandals look like children's fairy tales. Imagine being so desperate to divorce your wife that you literally break your entire country away from the Catholic Church, create your own religion, and risk war with the most powerful empire in Europe. That's exactly what Henry VII did in 1534, and it all started because he was obsessed with a woman who refused to sleep with him. But here's what most people don't know. According to recently discovered court records from the British National Archives, Henry didn't just have 6 wives. Historians now estimate he had over 40 documented mistresses throughout his reign, plus dozens more unrecorded affairs. We're talking about a man who was essentially running a royal dating app 500 years before Tinder existed. Let me paint you a picture of just how wild Henry's love life really was. In 1509, when he became king at 17, he was actually considered one of Europe's most eligible bachelors. Contemporary accounts describe him as 6 feet 2 inches tall, absolutely massive for the time, with golden hair, bright blue eyes, and an athletic build from his obsession with jousting and tennis. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Henry was the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes upon. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was actually his brother's widow. Yeah, that's right. Henry married his dead brother's wife, which was controversial even by royal standards. But here's the fascinating part. For their first 15 years of marriage, by all accounts, Henry was genuinely devoted to Catherine. Love letters between them, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, show a tender, romantic side of Henry that most people never hear about. He wrote to her, "The entire love I feel for you obliges me to inform you of the great loneliness I experienced since your departure." This was a man capable of deep emotion, which makes what happened next even more psychologically complex. The problem started when Catherine couldn't give Henry a male heir. She had multiple pregnancies, but only one child survived, Princess Mary. In the 1500s, infant mortality was around 60%, so this wasn't unusual. But Henry became obsessed with the idea that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Then, in 1526, everything changed. Henry met Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne wasn't conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards. She had dark hair and eyes when blonde was fashionable, and she was quite slender when curvy was preferred. But she had something that drove Henry absolutely wild. She was intelligent, witty, and most importantly, she refused to sleep with him. Think about it. Here's a man who's been king since he was 17, who's had essentially unlimited access to any woman in England, and suddenly he meets someone who says no. For a man accustomed to absolute power, that resistance became an obsession. Henry pursued Anne for 6 years. 6 years! The love letters he wrote to her, now housed in the Vatican, are almost embarrassingly passionate. He wrote, "I beseech you to advertise me expressly of your whole mind as to the love between us two." This is a king literally begging for attention from a woman who kept him at arm's length. But here's where the story gets absolutely insane. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, because doing so would anger Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry didn't just accept it. He declared himself the head of a new Church of England, dissolved over 800 monasteries across the country, seized their wealth, and redistributed their lands to nobles who supported his divorce. Let me put this in perspective. Henry essentially created the Protestant Reformation in England, not for theological reasons, but because he wanted to sleep with Anne Boleyn. The ripple effects of this decision are still shaping our world today. The religious freedom that America was founded on, it traces directly back to Henry's bedroom problems, and the tragedy is, it didn't even work out. After all that drama, all that religious upheaval, Henry married Anne in 1533, but their marriage was a disaster. Anne, who'd been so alluring when forbidden, apparently became sharp-tongued and demanding as queen. Within 3 years, Henry was convinced she was having affairs, though most historians believe these charges were fabricated. In 1536, Henry had Anne executed on charges of adultery, treason, and even incest with her own brother. The evidence was so flimsy that even Henry's own courtiers were shocked. But Henry had already moved on. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's execution. This pattern would repeat throughout his life. Wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, he divorced after 6 months because he found her physically unappealing. He famously called her a Flanders mare. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, was executed for adultery when she was barely 20 years old. His final wife, Catherine Parr, only survived because Henry died before he could tire of her. But what's really fascinating is how Henry's psychology changed over the years. Court physicians' records, analysed by modern medical historians, suggest Henry suffered from several head injuries from jousting accidents. Some experts believe these injuries, combined with what was likely type 2 diabetes, fundamentally altered his personality from the romantic young king into the paranoid tyrant we remember. Think about this. The same man who wrote passionate love letters became someone who casually ordered the execution of 2 wives. It's a terrifying example of how absolute power, combined with personal frustration, can corrupt even someone who started with genuine romantic ideals. And here's something that might surprise you about Henry's impact on modern America. The divorce culture we see today actually has roots in Henry's actions. Before Henry, marriage was considered absolutely indissoluble in Christian Europe. His break from Rome established the precedent that marriages could be ended, even for powerful people. Obviously, we've evolved far beyond Henry's murderous methods, but the basic concept that marriage isn't necessarily forever, that started with a lovesick king in Tudor England. The psychological profile of Henry VIII reads like a case study in how unlimited power affects human relationships. When you can have anyone executed for disagreeing with you, when you're told from birth that your desires are literally God's will, how do you develop healthy relationship skills? The answer is, you don't. But as dramatic as Henry's story is, he was actually just the beginning of European royal excess. Because while Henry was revolutionizing Christianity for love in England, across the English Channel in France, another young prince was watching and learning. Louis XIV would take everything Henry did and multiply it by 10. Where Henry had 6 wives and 40 mistresses, Louis would have 22 official mistresses and transform the very concept of royal seduction into an art form. Louis didn't just build the most expensive palace in human history to impress women. According to court records from Versailles, he created an entire culture where having mistresses wasn't just accepted, it was a competitive sport among the nobility. And the stories of what happened in those gilded halls of Versailles, well, they make Henry VIII's court look like a church picnic. Now, if Henry VIII changed religion for love, Louis XIV of France did something even more audacious. He turned adultery into a national policy. This is the man who declared "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, and then proceeded to run France like his personal dating empire for 72 years. Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, didn't just have mistresses, he revolutionized the entire concept. According to meticulously kept court records from the Archives Nationales in Paris, Louis had 22 official mistresses during his reign, each with their own apartments, servants, and annual budgets that often exceeded the military spending of smaller European nations. But here's what makes Louis absolutely fascinating from a psychological perspective. He turned his love affairs into a deliberate political strategy. While Henry VIII's relationships were chaotic and destructive, Louis carefully orchestrated his romantic life to maintain power, control the nobility, and even conduct international diplomacy. Let me tell you about the most expensive love nest in human history. Versailles wasn't just a palace. According to financial records analysed by French economic historians, it cost approximately 116 million livres to build, which equals about $2 billion in today's money. And Louis designed every single room, every garden pathway, every golden detail with one primary purpose: to seduce the most beautiful and influential women in Europe. The palace had secret passages connecting the king's apartments to various ladies' chambers. There were hidden staircases that allowed discreet meetings, private gardens for romantic encounters, and even special apartments called cabinets particuliers, essentially royal love suites with silk-lined walls, mirrored ceilings, and furniture specifically designed for intimate encounters. But Louis wasn't just building a fancy bachelor pad. He was creating what historians now call the theatre of seduction. Every day at Versailles was essentially a performance designed to demonstrate the king's irresistible power and charm. The famous Hall of Mirrors, with its 17 mirror-clad arches reflecting light from 357 mirrors, wasn't just beautiful architecture, it was psychological warfare. Imagine being a young duchess walking through that hall, seeing yourself reflected infinitely alongside the most powerful man in Europe. It was designed to be overwhelming, intoxicating, and it worked. Court memoirs from the period, particularly those of the Duchess of Orléans, described women literally fainting from excitement when Louis paid them attention. The king had turned royal seduction into such an art form that just being noticed by him could make a woman's career and her family's fortune. Let me share some specific stories that'll blow your mind. Louis's first major mistress was Louise de la Vallière, a shy 17-year-old who caught his eye in 1661. According to her personal diary discovered in 1847, she was initially terrified of the king's attention. But Louis was a master manipulator. He showered her with gifts worth millions in today's money. Diamond necklaces, private concerts by the greatest musicians in Europe, and even commissioned paintings of her by the most famous artists of the time. But here's where Louis's psychology gets really interesting. He didn't just want to possess these women, he wanted to display them as trophies of his power. Louise was given her own wing of Versailles, her own court, and even her own noble title. She essentially became a queen without the crown, and other European courts took notice. Then came Madame de Montespan, who makes modern celebrity drama look tame. According to court chronicles, she literally seduced the king away from Louise by being more intelligent, more witty, and more ruthlessly ambitious. She would attend court functions wearing increasingly elaborate gowns designed to outshine everyone, including the actual queen. The rivalry between Louis's mistresses became such public spectacle that foreign ambassadors would report on it in their diplomatic correspondence. Montespan had 4 children with Louis, all officially acknowledged and given royal titles, but she didn't stop there. Historical records show she spent astronomical sums on fashion, jewellery and entertainments, essentially using the royal treasury as her personal shopping fund. Her annual dress allowance alone was 40,000 livres, equivalent to about $800,000 today, for clothes. And here's something that might shock you. Queen Marie-Thérèse, Louise's actual wife, not only tolerated these affairs, she was sometimes friendly with the mistresses. Court letters reveal that the Queen once wrote to Montespan asking for advice on handling court politics. It's almost surreal. Imagine the First Lady asking the President's girlfriend for relationship advice. But Louis's most famous mistress was Madame de Maintenon, who started as a governess to his illegitimate children and ended up secretly marrying him after the Queen died. What's fascinating about Maintenon is that she was already a widow in her 40s when she caught Louis's attention. Not exactly the profile of a typical royal mistress, but she had something that ultimately proved more powerful than youth or beauty. She understood Louis's psychology. According to her private letters, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Maintenon realized that Louis, despite all his power and conquests, was fundamentally lonely. She wrote, "The king is like a child who has been given too many toys and doesn't know which one will truly make him happy." So instead of competing with his other women through beauty or drama, she offered him something none of them could: genuine intellectual companionship and emotional stability. The strategy worked so well that Louis secretly married her in 1683, and she remained his companion for the final 32 years of his life. It's actually a surprisingly touching love story, hidden within all the royal excess. But let's talk about the dark side of Louis's romantic empire, because it wasn't all gilded chambers and romantic poetry. The king's affairs created a culture of corruption that nearly bankrupted France. Noble families would essentially pimp out their daughters to gain royal favour. Young women were trained from childhood in the arts of seduction specifically to catch the king's eye. The competition became so intense that some resorted to poison, black magic, and even murder. The Affair of the Poisons in 1677 revealed a network of fortune-tellers, alchemists and poisoners serving the French aristocracy, with many of Louis's own mistresses implicated. Madame de Montespan herself was accused of using love potions and even attempting to poison her rivals. The scandal was so explosive that Louis had to conduct secret trials to avoid destroying the monarchy's reputation. And here's the ultimate irony. Louis XIV, who spent his entire reign indulging his romantic desires, inadvertently created the social conditions that would eventually lead to the French Revolution. The astronomical costs of maintaining Versailles and supporting the royal mistresses, combined with the corruption and inequality his system created, bred the resentment that would explode a century later under his descendants. Think about it. Marie Antoinette's let-them-eat-cake attitude wasn't created in a vacuum. It was the logical endpoint of a system that Louis XIV established, where royal pleasure took precedence over the people's welfare. But perhaps the most surprising thing about Louis XIV is how his romantic strategies influence modern politics and celebrity culture. The idea of using personal charisma, carefully crafted image, and strategic relationships to maintain power. That's essentially what every modern political leader and celebrity does, just without the official mistresses and golden palaces. Now, as excessive as Louis XIV was with his 22 official mistresses and his billion-dollar love palace, he was still playing by certain rules. He maintained relationships, he supported his children, and he at least tried to balance his desires with royal duty. But our next prince took royal promiscuity to such an extreme level that mathematicians literally had to calculate whether his claims were biologically possible. Augustus the Strong of Saxony allegedly fathered 365 children, and the stories of how he supposedly achieved this legendary feat are so outrageous, they sound like something out of a fantasy novel. Meet Augustus the Strong of Saxony, a man so legendary that when he claimed to have fathered 365 children, 18th century mathematicians actually sat down with quills and parchment to calculate whether this was biologically possible. Their conclusion, documented in the Dresden State Archives, was surprisingly optimistic. While unprecedented, such productivity would require the prince to maintain intimate relations with approximately 1-2 women per day for 30 years, accounting for pregnancy intervals and seasonal variations in fertility. I love that they actually did the math on this guy's love life. Augustus Thect, who ruled Saxony and Poland from 1697 to 1733, wasn't just called the Strong because of his political power. According to contemporary accounts from the Saxon court, this man could allegedly bend iron horseshoes with his bare hands, roll up silver plates like paper, and once famously broke a chain of 30 horseshoes linked together. But his most impressive demonstrations of strength, if the legends are true, happened behind closed doors. The 365 children story comes from Augustus's own court chroniclers, who kept meticulous records of royal acknowledgements. Now here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. Only 11 of these children were officially recognized and given noble titles, according to genealogical records maintained by the Saxon nobility. But court gossips and foreign ambassadors regularly reported on Augustus's incredible appetite and stamina. The Venetian ambassador wrote in 1704, "His Majesty's vigour in all pursuits is without equal in Christendom. Whether in matters of war, sport, or personal entertainment, he approaches each endeavour with the enthusiasm of 10 ordinary men." That's diplomatic speak for, this guy is absolutely insatiable. But what makes Augustus fascinating isn't just the numbers, it's how he turned his legendary virility into a political brand. In an era when royal power was often questioned, Augustus used his reputation as Europe's most virile prince to project an image of strength, fertility, and divine blessing. Other kings had armies and treasuries. Augustus had something more primal. He represented raw masculine power in its most basic form, and he wasn't subtle about it. Augustus commissioned paintings of himself as Hercules, as Mars the god of war, and even as Jupiter seducing mortal women. The walls of Dresden Castle were covered with artwork celebrating masculine conquest and fertility. He essentially turned his palace into a shrine to his own sexual prowess. The court culture he created was unlike anything else in Europe. According to memoirs by Count Heinrich von Brühl, Augustus's chief minister, the Saxon court became a destination for the most beautiful women across the continent. Fathers from noble families would literally travel hundreds of miles hoping their daughters might catch the king's attention, because bearing one of Augustus's children, even illegitimately, could set a family up for generations. Here's a specific story that shows you just how wild things got. In 1719, Augustus held what he called the Festival of Strength and Beauty at his hunting lodge in Moritzburg. According to detailed court records preserved in Dresden, this 3-week celebration featured competitions where noble women would demonstrate various domestic skills during the day, and Augustus would personally evaluate the winners each evening. The festival became so famous that foreign dignitaries requested invitations just to witness this spectacle of royal excess. The British ambassador wrote, "His Polish Majesty has created entertainments that would make the Roman emperors blush, yet conducted with such ceremony that one cannot help but admire the organization, if not the morality." But let me share something that reveals Augustus's surprisingly calculating mind behind all this legendary lust. Modern historians analysing his correspondence have discovered that many of his affairs were strategically chosen. He would seduce the wives and daughters of political opponents to humiliate them, bed the relatives of foreign ambassadors to gain diplomatic leverage, and romance wealthy heiresses to fund his expensive military campaigns. Take his affair with Countess Aurora von Königsmarck, a Swedish noblewoman. According to letters between them discovered in 1892, their relationship wasn't just passionate, it was a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation. Aurora was feeding Augustus information about Swedish military plans while he was simultaneously fighting Sweden for control of Poland. He was literally sleeping his way to military victory. The most documented of his relationships was with Countess Anna Constantia von Cosel, who bore him 3 children and lived openly as his unofficial queen for over a decade. Her detailed diary, housed in the Saxon State Library, provides incredible insights into what daily life was like as Augustus's primary mistress. She wrote, "His Majesty possesses an energy that would exhaust 3 ordinary men. He rises before dawn for military exercises, spends the morning reviewing state papers, the afternoon in physical contest with his officers, and the evening, well, the evening belongs to more intimate pursuits. I have never known a man who approaches every aspect of life with such relentless vigour. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Anna Constantia eventually began demanding that Augustus divorce his wife and marry her officially. When he refused, she threatened to reveal state secrets she had learned during their pillow talk. Augustus's response was swift and brutal. He had her imprisoned in the fortress of Stolpen, where she spent the last 49 years of her life in solitary confinement. This reveals something crucial about Augustus's psychology. For all his legendary charm and supposed romantic nature, he was ultimately a pragmatist who viewed relationships as tools of power. When those tools threatened his authority, he discarded them without hesitation. Now, about those 365 children, modern genetic analysis has actually tried to verify this claim. In the 1990s, genealogists from the University of Leipzig traced Augustus's confirmed bloodline and found evidence for approximately 47 legitimate descendants whose DNA matches royal Saxon lineage. But here's the fascinating part. They also found Augustus's genetic markers in hundreds of Saxon families with no official connection to the royal house. Dr. Wilhelm Richter, who led the study, concluded, while 365 children seems mathematically improbable, our DNA evidence suggests Augustus's genetic influence on the Saxon population was indeed extraordinary. He may not have fathered a child every day of the year, but he certainly left his mark on the gene pool. The psychological impact of Augustus's reputation extended far beyond his bedroom. He created a culture where physical prowess and sexual conquest became measures of political legitimacy. Other European princes began competing to match his legendary stamina, leading to what historians call the masculinity arms race of the early 1700s. This had real political consequences. Several minor German princes bankrupted their treasuries trying to maintain courts as lavish and pleasure-focused as Augustus's. The competition to demonstrate royal virility led to a generation of rulers who prioritized personal indulgence over effective governance, contributing to the political fragmentation that would plague Germany for centuries. But perhaps Augustus's most lasting legacy is how he transformed the very concept of royal charisma. Before him, kings demonstrated their divine right through ceremony, tradition, and military might. Augustus proved that raw physical appeal and legendary sexual prowess could be just as politically powerful. He essentially invented the modern concept of the celebrity politician, someone whose personal life and physical attributes become inseparable from their public authority. And you know what's really wild? Modern psychologists studying leadership charisma often reference Augustus as an early example of what they call primal dominance theory, the idea that leaders who project physical and sexual confidence naturally attract followers, even when their actual policies might be questionable. Think about it. We still see this today in politics and entertainment. The most successful leaders often combine policy positions with personal magnetism and carefully crafted images of strength and appeal. Augustus was essentially running the 18th century version of an Instagram influence campaign, just with oil paintings instead of selfies. But for all his legendary conquests and political maneuvering, Augustus represents something profoundly lonely about absolute power. Here was a man who could have any woman in Europe, who commanded armies and ruled kingdoms, yet his closest relationships were still ultimately transactions. Even his most passionate affairs were shadowed by calculations of advantage and control. As impressive as Augustus's legendary stamina was, he was still fundamentally a political animal using romance as a tool. But our next prince took a completely different approach to seduction. Where Augustus relied on royal power and physical dominance, Giacomo Casanova elevated seduction to an art form based on psychology, intellect, and genuine emotional connection. His detailed memoirs reveal secrets of human attraction that modern dating experts still study today, and his adventures across Europe read like the most elaborate romantic novel ever written. While Augustus conquered through royal power and physical dominance, Giacomo Casanova revolutionized seduction through something far more sophisticated: pure psychological genius. This Venetian adventurer, who technically held the minor title of Chevalier de Seingalt, documented 122 intimate relationships in his 12-volume memoirs, and reading them is like getting a masterclass in human psychology from history's greatest expert on romantic attraction. Here's what makes Casanova absolutely fascinating. He had no royal army, no inherited wealth, no political power. He was essentially a middle-class guy from Venice who became Europe's most legendary lover through sheer intellectual brilliance and emotional intelligence. His detailed memoirs, Histoire de ma vie, weren't published until 1960, but they contain insights about human attraction that modern relationship experts still quote today. According to his own meticulous records, Casanova's conquests included duchesses, nuns, married aristocrats, actresses, merchants' daughters, and even a few men, because for Casanova, seduction was about connection, not just conquest. He wrote, "The true art of love lies not in the taking, but in the giving of pleasure. A woman who feels truly understood will give you not just her body, but her soul." That's a pretty sophisticated understanding of human psychology for someone born in 1725. Let me share a specific story that shows you exactly how Casanova's mind worked. In 1753, he met Henriette, a mysterious French noblewoman travelling in disguise. Instead of trying to impress her with wealth or status he didn't have, Casanova spent 3 days simply talking with her about philosophy, literature, music, politics. He discovered she was incredibly educated but felt intellectually stifled by her aristocratic marriage. So what did Casanova do? He didn't seduce her physically, he seduced her mind first. He arranged for her to attend secret intellectual salons where she could debate with scholars and writers. He introduced her to banned books. He made her feel like the brilliant woman she was, not just a beautiful ornament. According to his memoirs, their affair lasted only 3 months, but Henriette later wrote him, "You gave me back to myself. In your eyes, I rediscovered not just my beauty, but my intelligence, my worth as a human being." Casanova kept that letter for the rest of his life, calling it his most treasured possession. This reveals something profound about Casanova's approach. While other princes collected women like trophies, Casanova genuinely studied each woman as a unique individual. He would spend weeks learning about their interests, their frustrations, their secret dreams, and then craft personalized experiences that made them feel truly seen and valued. Modern psychologists call this emotional attunement, and it's considered one of the most powerful tools for building deep human connections. Casanova was essentially practicing advanced relationship psychology 3 centuries before it was formally studied. But let's talk about some of his more adventurous escapades, because Casanova's life reads like the most elaborate romantic comedy ever written. In 1755, he was imprisoned in Venice's notorious Piombi prison for atheism and moral corruption. The Piombi was considered escape-proof. It was built into the roof of the Doge's palace, with cells so small you couldn't stand upright. Casanova not only escaped, he did it in the most dramatically romantic way possible. He spent months loosening a floor beam with a metal spike, then crawled through the palace roof at night. But here's the Casanova touch. He left a note for the guards that read, "I have departed, but my heart remains imprisoned by the beauty of Venetian women." Even his prison break was somehow charming and flirtatious. The escape made him famous across Europe, and suddenly every aristocratic salon wanted to meet the man who had outwitted the Venetian authorities. But instead of capitalizing on this fame for personal gain, Casanova used it to gain access to the most interesting women on the continent. His affair with Madame d'Urfé, a wealthy Parisian occultist, shows his incredible psychological insight. D'Urfé was obsessed with alchemy and believed she could achieve immortality through mystical rituals. Instead of mocking her beliefs, Casanova studied occult texts for months until he could discuss her interests as knowledgeably as any scholar. He wrote, "To love someone truly, you must enter their world completely, even if that world seems strange to you." Madame d'Urfé's fascination with the supernatural was not foolishness. It was her way of seeking meaning and transcendence in a world that often felt meaningless. Through this relationship, which lasted several years, Casanova gained access to Parisian high society and funding for his various adventures. But what's remarkable is that his letters to d'Urfé, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, show genuine affection and respect, not just manipulation. This pattern repeated throughout his life. Casanova would identify what each woman truly needed: intellectual stimulation, emotional validation, adventure, spiritual connection, and then provide exactly that. It wasn't about overpowering or impressing them. It was about understanding and fulfilling their deepest desires. His techniques would be revolutionary even today. He pioneered what modern dating experts call mirroring, subtly matching someone's communication style and interest to build rapport. He understood the psychology of scarcity, making himself slightly unavailable to increase desire. He mastered emotional escalation, gradually building intimacy through shared experiences and vulnerabilities. But perhaps his most advanced technique was what he called the gift of complete attention, NEM. In an era where aristocratic men were often distracted by politics, warfare, and multiple affairs, Casanova would focus entirely on one woman at a time, making her feel like the most fascinating person in the world. He wrote, "When I'm with a woman, she is my entire universe. I listen not just to her words, but to the music of her voice, the rhythm of her breathing, the stories told by her gestures. This attention is the greatest aphrodisiac, for every human soul yearns to be truly seen." That's pretty profound relationship advice, honestly. The psychological depth of Casanova's approach becomes even more impressive when you consider his background. Born to actress parents in Venice, he was essentially raised in the theatre world, which taught him to read emotions, understand motivations, and present different versions of himself to different audiences. But unlike the calculating manipulation of someone like Louis XIV, Casanova's adaptability seemed to come from genuine curiosity about human nature. His memoirs are filled with detailed character studies of his lovers, analysing their personalities, backgrounds, and psychological needs with the precision of a modern therapist. Take his relationship with the nun Mem at the Murano convent. Instead of seeing her religious vows as an obstacle, Casanova understood that her spiritual nature was part of her appeal. He wrote her letters comparing their physical love to mystical union with the divine, framing their affair as a sacred experience rather than a sinful one. This allowed her to maintain her religious identity while exploring her sexuality, a psychological sophistication that's honestly quite impressive for the 1750s. Modern relationship researchers have actually studied Casanova's memoirs to understand what they call authentic seduction, building attraction through genuine emotional connection rather than manipulation or coercion. Dr. Helen Fisher, the anthropologist who studies love and attraction, has written that Casanova's approach demonstrates an intuitive understanding of brain chemistry and attachment patterns that wouldn't be scientifically proven until the 21st century. But here's what might surprise you about Casanova. For all his legendary conquests, he was often genuinely heartbroken when relationships ended. His memoirs are filled with passages mourning lost loves, analysing what went wrong, and expressing real regret for relationships that couldn't last. He wrote about Henriette. "I have known the bodies of many women, but I have touched few souls as deeply as hers. In losing her, I lost a part of myself that I have never recovered." This emotional vulnerability, combined with his intellectual sophistication, created a romantic persona that was both confident and sensitive, incredibly attractive to women who are used to men who are either brutishly dominant or boringly conventional. The tragedy of Casanova's later life reveals the ultimate limitation of even the most sophisticated seduction techniques. As he aged, his legendary charm couldn't overcome the basic human need for lasting companionship. His final years were spent as librarian in a Czech castle, writing his memoirs and corresponding with former lovers who remembered him fondly but had moved on to more stable relationships. Yet his influence on our understanding of attraction and relationships continues today. Dating coaches still teach Casanova techniques. Relationship therapists reference his insights about emotional attunement. Even modern romance novels often feature Casanova-inspired characters who combine intelligence, sensitivity, and mysterious charm. But while Casanova elevated seduction to an art form through psychology and genuine connection, our story now takes us to a prince whose approach to romance was far more reckless and ultimately destructive. Prince Regent George IV of Britain combined royal privilege with personal excess in ways that nearly destroyed the British monarchy itself. His scandalous secret marriage, his astronomical debts, and his public displays of debauchery created constitutional crises that echo through British politics even today. Where Casanova used psychological brilliance to win hearts, Britain's Prince Regent George IV took the exact opposite approach. He used royal privilege to steamroll through every social convention, moral boundary, and legal restriction in his path. The result was a scandal so massive that it nearly toppled the British monarchy and cost the equivalent of $50 million in today's money. And somehow, the British people still loved him for it. George IV's story begins with what might be the most expensive midlife crisis in royal history. In 1785, at age 23, the Prince of Wales fell madly in love with Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic commoner. Now, according to the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, stored in the British Parliamentary Archives, George couldn't legally marry anyone without his father King George III's permission, and marrying a Catholic would actually disqualify him from inheriting the throne entirely. George's solution? He decided to ignore the law completely. On December 15, 1785, in Maria Fitzherbert's drawing room on Park Street in London, George participated in a secret Anglican wedding ceremony. The only witnesses were Maria's uncle and a close friend. According to Maria's personal diary, discovered in 1905, George was so nervous he could barely speak his vows, and he presented her with a wedding ring that cost $30,000, equivalent to about $6 million today. But here's where it gets absolutely wild. This marriage was simultaneously illegal under British law, invalid under Church of England doctrine, and treasonous under Catholic legislation. George had managed to break 3 different sets of laws with a single "I do," and he didn't care. For the next decade, George and Maria lived as husband and wife, entertaining lavishly at their Brighton pavilion, which George was simultaneously transforming into the most outrageous pleasure palace in British history. Financial records from the Royal Archives show that George spent $155,000 renovating Brighton Pavilion between 1815 and 1823. That's over $30 million in today's money, turning it into what contemporary visitors described as an oriental fantasy designed by a madman with unlimited funds. The pavilion had golden dragons supporting the ceiling, crystal chandeliers weighing over a ton each, and a banqueting hall designed to look like a tropical garden complete with palm tree columns and exotic bird decorations. Foreign ambassadors reported that dinner parties there felt like dining inside a jeweled hallucination. But George's spending on architecture was nothing compared to what he spent on personal pleasure. According to detailed accounts kept by his treasurer Thomas Coutts, George's annual clothing budget alone was $8,000, equivalent to about $1.6 million today. He owned over 300 uniforms, including one coat with so many gold buttons and decorations that it weighed 47 pounds. Imagine trying to dance while wearing a jacket that weighs as much as a medium-sized dog. The man was obsessed with fashion to a degree that would make modern influencers jealous. He introduced the Regency style of men's dress, high collars, fitted coats, and elaborate cravats, and spent hours each morning with his valets perfecting his appearance. Contemporary accounts describe him taking 2 hours just to tie his cravat correctly. But George's true excess wasn't in clothes or architecture. It was in entertaining. His dinner parties at Carlton House, his London residence, became legendary for their extravagance. A single dinner in 1811 to celebrate his official appointment as Prince Regent cost $120,000, equivalent to $24 million today, for one meal. The menu, preserved in the royal collection, included over 100 different dishes: turtle soup, venison from 12 different estates, wines from every major European vineyard, and desserts that required their own architectural engineering. One dessert was a working fountain that sprayed champagne, surrounded by sugar sculptures of Greek gods. They literally had edible architecture. And this was during the Napoleonic Wars, when ordinary British citizens were struggling with food shortages and economic hardship. The optics were not great. Foreign observers were both fascinated and horrified by George's lifestyle. The Austrian ambassador wrote, "His Royal Highness has created a court culture that surpasses Versailles in its magnificence and Rome in its decadence. Whether this represents the pinnacle of civilization or its imminent collapse, I cannot determine." But George's romantic life was even more scandalous than his spending. While secretly married to Maria Fitzherbert, he publicly carried on affairs with dozens of aristocratic women. His most notorious relationship was with Lady Jersey, described by contemporary gossips as a woman whose beauty is matched only by her ruthless ambition. According to letters between them, housed in the British Library, Lady Jersey basically ran George's social life for several years, deciding which parties he attended, which friends he saw, and even which mistresses he was allowed to pursue. She was essentially his unofficial Prime Minister of Pleasure. The psychological dynamic here is fascinating. George had unlimited wealth and absolute social privilege, but he seemed to crave being controlled by strong women. Modern psychologists analysing his correspondence have noted patterns consistent with what we now call power paradox. People with ultimate authority often seek relationships where they can surrender control, but Lady Jersey's influence created a new problem. She convinced George that he needed to marry officially to secure his inheritance and pay off his mounting debts. By 1794, George owed $630,000, equivalent to about $50 million today. His father, King George III, agreed to pay the debts, but only if George married his cousin, Princess Caroline of Brunswick. Here's where the story becomes almost tragic. George had never met Caroline, but when she arrived in England in 1795, he took one look at her and was reportedly so repulsed that he immediately called for a glass of brandy. Caroline, for her part, later wrote that George was fat, ugly, and smelled of alcohol and perfume in equal measure. Their wedding night was apparently such a disaster that George was drunk throughout the ceremony and, according to Caroline's later testimony, passed out in the fireplace of their bridal chamber. They conceived their only child, Princess Charlotte, during one of their few subsequent encounters, then essentially separated permanently. But remember, George was still secretly married to Maria Fitzherbert, so he was simultaneously married to two women, one legally, one emotionally, while carrying on affairs with multiple others. The legal and emotional complexity was staggering. The British press, finally getting access to some of these stories, began what historians call the first modern celebrity scandal coverage. Satirical cartoons showed George as a bloated prince surrounded by mistresses, while his legal wife Caroline was depicted as a victim of royal cruelty. Public opinion was split in a fascinating way. Working-class Britons were outraged by George's spending during wartime hardship, but middle-class society was actually entertained by the romantic drama. Upper-class society, meanwhile, was mostly concerned about the constitutional implications of a bigamous heir to the throne. The crisis reached its peak in 1820 when George became king and immediately tried to divorce Caroline so he could officially marry Maria Fitzherbert. But Caroline had spent the intervening years building public support by travelling Europe and positioning herself as the wronged wife of a debauched prince. When she returned to England to claim her position as Queen, massive crowds lined the streets of London chanting "God save the Queen," meaning Caroline, not George. The government was forced to put Caroline on trial for adultery in what became the most sensational legal proceeding of the century. For months, British newspapers published daily details of the royal marriage's most intimate failures. Witnesses testified about George's drinking, his affairs, his secret marriage, and his treatment of Caroline. It was like a 19th century reality TV show, except the future of the monarchy was at stake. The trial ultimately failed to convict Caroline, but the damage to royal prestige was enormous. Foreign governments began questioning whether the British monarchy was stable enough to honour international treaties. There were serious discussions in Parliament about replacing the entire royal system with a republic. Yet somehow George survived it all. When he finally became king in 1820, he threw himself into the role with the same excessive enthusiasm he'd brought to everything else. His coronation cost $240,000, equivalent to nearly $50 million today, and featured a procession so elaborate that it took 4 hours to march from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace. And here's the strangest part. By the end of his reign, many British people had developed genuine affection for George IV. His personal charm, his patronage of arts and architecture, and his essentially harmless self-indulgence made him seem more human than the aloof, duty-bound monarchs who came before. As the Duke of Wellington said, "He was a bad son, a bad husband, a bad father, a bad subject, a bad monarch, and a bad friend." But somehow he was never boring. That might be the most British epitaph ever written. But while George IV's scandals nearly destroyed the British monarchy through sheer excess and public embarrassment, our next prince created an entirely different kind of royal crisis. Prince Albert Victor, heir to the British throne in the 1880s, became entangled in rumours so dark and conspiracy theories so elaborate that they're still debated by historians today. His alleged involvement in everything from underground gay clubs to Jack the Ripper murders created a constitutional crisis that was solved only by his mysterious and convenient death. Sometimes the most dangerous royal scandals aren't about excessive spending or public affairs. They're about secrets so dark that the monarchy will do anything to bury them. Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie to his family, was heir to the British throne in the 1880s when he became entangled in conspiracy theories that still fascinate historians today. Underground male prostitution rings, Jack the Ripper murders, and a mysterious death that conveniently solved all the royal family's problems at once. Albert Victor's story represents the collision between Victorian moral hypocrisy and royal necessity. Born in 1864, he was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, which made him second in line to the throne. But according to confidential reports in the royal archives, from childhood onward, courtiers worried that something was different about Prince Eddie. His tutor, John Neil Dalton, wrote in private correspondence, "His Royal Highness displays a dreamy, languid disposition quite unsuited to his future responsibilities. He shows little interest in traditional masculine pursuits and seems drawn to alternative companionships." In Victorian code language, this was basically saying the future king might be gay. The first major scandal broke in 1889 with what became known as the Cleveland Street Affair. Police raided a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street in London and discovered a network of upper-class clients, including several members of Parliament and, according to some sources, Prince Albert Victor himself. The evidence comes from the personal papers of Lord Arthur Somerset, one of the accused discovered in 1975. Somerset wrote to his friend, "The situation is more delicate than previously imagined. Certain royal connections has been suggested, and the Prime Minister himself has instructed that this matter be handled with utmost discretion." Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The official investigation was suddenly dropped. Several key witnesses disappeared from London, and the entire case was sealed under the Official Secrets Act. The abrupt end to the investigation only fueled more speculation about royal involvement. But the Cleveland Street scandal was just the beginning. In 1888, the Jack the Ripper murders had terrorised London, and by 1890 some conspiracy theorists were suggesting a royal connection. The theory, first proposed by Surgeon William Gull's son-in-law, claimed that Prince Albert Victor had fathered an illegitimate child with a Catholic shop girl named Annie Crook, and that the Ripper murders were part of a government cover-up to silence witnesses. According to this theory, documented in FBI files from the 1970s, when American investigators looked into the case, Jack the Ripper wasn't a random serial killer, but a royal physician eliminating anyone who knew about the prince's secret marriage and child. The alleged victims, Mary Kelly, Annie Chapman and others, were supposedly Annie Crook's friends who knew about the royal baby. Now, I have to say, most serious historians consider this theory completely unsupported by evidence. But what makes it fascinating is how perfectly it captured Victorian anxieties about royal morality and government conspiracy. The idea that the future king could be involved in such darkness struck at the heart of the monarchy's moral authority. Contemporary police records housed at the Metropolitan Police Museum show that Prince Albert Victor actually had alibis for most of the Ripper murders. He was either at Sandringham with family or on official duties elsewhere. But the rumours persisted because they fit a pattern of concerning behaviour that courtiers were already whispering about. Lord Esher, close advisor to the royal family, wrote in his private diary, "Prince Eddie's associations cause constant anxiety. His interests run to areas that would prove most damaging should they become public knowledge. The question is no longer whether he is suitable to be king, but whether the monarchy could survive his reign." The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts is of a young man struggling with his identity in an impossibly restrictive environment. Victorian society had no framework for understanding or accepting sexual diversity, and for a future king, any deviation from heterosexual norms was literally treasonous. Dr. Edgar Shepherd, who treated several members of the royal family, wrote in confidential medical reports, "His Royal Highness exhibits signs of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. The pressures of his position, combined with his natural temperament, create a volatile psychological state that requires careful management. This gives us insight into what Albert Victor was actually experiencing. Imagine being born into a role you can never escape, knowing that your natural inclinations could destroy not just your own life, but the entire institution you're meant to represent. The psychological pressure must have been crushing. The royal family's solution was typically Victorian. They decided to marry Albert Victor off quickly to a suitable princess who could provide heirs and stability. In 1891, they arranged his engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, a sensible German princess known for her strong character and royal bloodline. According to Mary's personal letters, housed in the royal collection, she was well aware of the rumours about Albert Victor, but believed she could reform him through marriage and proper guidance. She wrote to her mother, "I am prepared to do my duty to the crown, whatever personal sacrifices may be required." But fate, or perhaps royal convenience, intervened. In January 1892, just 6 weeks before his wedding, Prince Albert Victor died suddenly of pneumonia at Sandringham. He was only 28 years old. The timing was so convenient that conspiracy theories immediately flourished. Some suggested he was poisoned to prevent a constitutional crisis. Others claimed he was secretly exiled to Australia or America. The most dramatic theory was that his death was faked, and he lived out his days in a remote castle, painting watercolours and writing poetry. The official cause of death, signed by 3 royal physicians, was influenza followed by pneumonia. But Dr. Francis Laking's private notes, discovered in 1986, mention complications arising from the patient's nervous condition and recent emotional disturbances. Some historians interpret this as suggesting Albert Victor might have died by suicide or from complications related to stress and depression. What we know for certain is that Albert Victor's death solved multiple problems simultaneously. The Cleveland Street scandal was permanently buried. The Jack the Ripper theories lost their royal connection, and Princess Mary of Teck was redirected to marry Albert Victor's younger brother George, who became the highly successful King George V. The cover-up was remarkably thorough. Albert Victor's personal papers were destroyed, his correspondence was sealed, even his rooms at Sandringham were closed and their contents burned. It was as if the royal family was trying to erase him from history entirely. Modern historians have tried to piece together the truth using DNA analysis, psychological profiling, and newly discovered documents. The consensus is that Albert Victor was probably gay or bisexual, was likely involved in some form of scandal that threatened the monarchy, and died at a remarkably convenient time for everyone involved. But here's what makes this story particularly tragic. Albert Victor seems to have been a sensitive, artistic young man trapped in an impossible situation. Contemporary accounts describe him as kind, gentle, and interested in poetry and painting, qualities that were seen as weaknesses in a future king, but that might have made him a more humane monarch. His death changed the entire trajectory of British history. George V, who became king instead, led Britain through World War I with a steady hand that Albert Victor might not have possessed. But we'll never know what kind of king Albert Victor might have been, or how British society might have evolved differently if forced to accept a monarch who challenged conventional notions of masculinity and sexuality. The Albert Victor affair reveals something crucial about how royal families manage existential threats. When faced with a scandal that could destroy the monarchy's moral authority, they don't just deny or deflect, they erase. The systematic destruction of evidence, the convenient death, the immediate redirection of the succession, it shows institutional survival instincts that operate beyond individual lives. This pattern of royal damage control would be repeated throughout European history, but rarely as dramatically or effectively as in Albert Victor's case. The British monarchy survived intact. George V proved to be an excellent king, and the dark secrets of the 1890s remained buried for nearly a century. But while the British royal family was secretly dealing with scandals that threatened their moral authority, across Europe, another prince was openly living a lifestyle so unconventional that it shocked even the permissive aristocratic society of his time. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Mad King, built fairy tale castles while conducting mysterious relationships that historians still debate today. His story reveals what happens when a prince refuses to hide his true nature, regardless of the consequences. From royal scandals hidden in shadows, we now turn to a love story so tragic that it literally changed the course of European history. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary didn't just die for love. His forbidden romance and mysterious death at Mayerling in 1889 sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe and set in motion events that would eventually help trigger World War I. This is the story of how one prince's desperate choice between duty and desire accidentally reshaped the modern world. Rudolf Habsburg was born in 1858 into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, heir to the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians. But from childhood, he was caught between his liberal intellectual nature and the rigid conservative expectations of his father, Emperor Franz Joseph I. According to Rudolph's personal tutor, Count Joseph Latour von Thurmberg, whose memoirs were published in 1924, the young prince was brilliant but melancholic, possessed of a keen intellect that constantly chafed against the limitations of his imperial destiny. Rudolph spoke 8 languages fluently, studied natural sciences at the University of Vienna, and wrote extensively about politics and philosophy. But none of these intellectual pursuits impressed his traditional military father. The psychological tension in the Habsburg family was crushing. Franz Joseph, who had ruled since 1848, believed in absolute imperial authority and conservative Catholic values. Rudolph, influenced by liberal tutors and the scientific rationalism of the 1870s, favoured constitutional monarchy, Hungarian autonomy, and progressive social reforms. Their conflicts, documented in letters preserved in the Vienna State Archives, were epic. Rudolph wrote to his close friend Moritz Seps, "My father and I inhabit different centuries. He sees the monarchy as a divine institution that must never change. I see it as a human institution that must evolve or die. This fundamental disagreement poisons every interaction between us. The breaking point came over Hungary. Rudolph believed Austria-Hungary should grant greater autonomy to its various ethnic groups, particularly the Hungarians and Slavs. Franz Joseph saw any concession as weakness that would destroy the empire. When Rudolph began secretly meeting with Hungarian politicians to discuss reform, his father was furious. Court records show that in 1888, Franz Joseph actually considered having Rudolph arrested for treason. Prime Minister Eduard Taffer wrote in confidential correspondence, "His Majesty is convinced that the Crown Prince's political activities constitute a direct threat to imperial unity. The situation has become untenable." Into this toxic family drama stepped 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera, a stunningly beautiful aristocrat from a minor noble family. Mary was everything Rudolph's arranged marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was not: passionate, intelligent, and genuinely interested in his political ideas. Their affair began in late 1888, and Rudolph's letters to Mary, discovered in 1955, reveal a man desperately in love but consumed by despair about his future. He wrote, "You're the only pure thing in my corrupted world. With you, I remember what it feels like to be human rather than merely royal." But this wasn't just a romantic escape for Rudolph, it was also political suicide. Mary came from a liberal family with Jewish connections, exactly the kind of relationship that would enrage conservative Catholic Austria-Hungary. If their affair became public, it would destroy not just Rudolph's marriage but his claim to the throne. The psychological pressure on Rudolph intensified throughout 1888. His marriage to Stephanie had been loveless from the start. She later wrote that Rudolph was charming in public but cold and distant in private, as if he were perpetually acting a role he despised. Their only child, daughter Elizabeth, seemed to be Rudolph's sole joy in his official life. Meanwhile, his political isolation was complete. Franz Joseph had systematically excluded Rudolph from important government decisions. Hungarian politicians who had initially supported his reform ideas distanced themselves when they realized he had no real power. Even his military career, traditionally a source of Habsburg pride, frustrated him because he was given only ceremonial roles. Dr. Hermann Weiderhofer, the imperial family physician, wrote in confidential medical reports that Rudolph showed clear signs of depression and was likely using morphine and alcohol to cope with stress. Modern psychiatric analysis of these reports suggests Rudolph was experiencing what we would now recognize as severe clinical depression, combined with political despair. By January 1889, Rudolph seemed to be planning something drastic. He wrote a series of farewell letters to close friends, settled his debts, and made arrangements for his personal papers to be destroyed. On January 28th, he invited Mary Vetsera to join him at his hunting lodge in Mayerling, about an hour from Vienna. What happened next remains one of history's most debated mysteries. On the morning of January 30th, 1889, Rudolph's valet found both the Crown Prince and Mary Vetsera dead in the lodge's bedroom. The official investigation, sealed for decades, concluded that Rudolph shot Mary and then killed himself. But the evidence was immediately compromised. Emperor Franz Joseph ordered the scene cleaned before proper forensic examination. Mary's body was secretly removed and buried without autopsy. All physical evidence was destroyed, and witnesses were sworn to secrecy under threat of treason charges. The cover-up was so thorough that conspiracy theories immediately flourished. Some claimed Rudolph was assassinated by French agents because of his Hungarian sympathies. Others suggested he was killed by conservative Austrian nobles who opposed his liberal politics. The most dramatic theory was that he faked his death and escaped to America. What we know from the few surviving documents paints a picture of a murder-suicide driven by despair rather than passion. Rudolph's final letter to his mother, Empress Elizabeth, survived the destruction. He wrote, "I have chosen this path because I cannot bear to live without honour, and I cannot live with honour under the current circumstances. The woman who dies with me chose this fate freely, as I have chosen mine." This suggests that Rudolph and Mary made a deliberate pact, viewing death as preferable to the impossible situation they faced. In Catholic Austria-Hungary, divorce was unthinkable. Royal marriages were political contracts that couldn't be broken, and Rudolph's affair with Mary would have meant permanent exile from his homeland and family. The immediate political consequences were enormous. Rudolph's death made his younger brother Franz Ferdinand the heir to the throne, fundamentally changing Austria-Hungary's future direction. Franz Ferdinand was more conservative than Rudolph, but also more militaristic, setting the stage for the aggressive foreign policy that would contribute to World War I. The psychological impact on the Habsburg family was devastating. Empress Elizabeth never recovered from losing her son and was assassinated by an anarchist in 1898. Emperor Franz Joseph became even more rigid and isolated, making the political compromises Rudolph had advocated increasingly impossible. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Mayerling incident is how it represented the collision between personal authenticity and institutional obligation. Rudolph genuinely loved Mary and believed in political reform, but the Habsburg system allowed no space for either genuine emotion or progressive change. Modern historians analysing the case have noted parallels to other royal suicides throughout history. Dr. Brigitte Heymann, Austria's leading expert on the Habsburgs, wrote, "Rudolph's death represents the ultimate failure of the imperial system to accommodate human complexity. He was destroyed not by external enemies but by the impossible expectations of his own dynasty." The cover-up also reveals how royal families manage existential crises. Rather than allow Rudolph's death to become a symbol of dynastic failure, the Habsburgs transformed it into a romantic tragedy that obscured the deeper political and psychological issues involved. The ripple effects of Rudolph's death extended far beyond Austria-Hungary. Other European royal families began questioning whether their traditional approaches to succession and marriage were sustainable in the modern world. The incident contributed to broader discussions about constitutional monarchy, individual rights, and the role of personal happiness in royal duty. Yet there's something profoundly human about Rudolph's story that transcends its political implications. Here was a young man caught between his authentic self and impossible expectations, who ultimately chose death rather than a life of complete compromise. It's a tragedy that resonates even today when we think about the psychological costs of public life and institutional pressure. The Mayerling incident also marked a turning point in how European society viewed royal authority. The idea that princes and kings were fundamentally different from ordinary people began to crack when confronted with Rudolph's very human struggle between love and duty. But while Rudolph's story ended in tragedy, our next prince represents a very different approach to managing the tension between royal duty and personal desire. Edward VII of Britain, who had become king in 1901, spent decades as the playboy prince conducting dozens of affairs while somehow maintaining public affection and political effectiveness. His story shows how a royal can indulge enormous appetites while still serving the crown successfully. Where tragedy destroyed one prince, another turned potential scandal into political genius. Edward VII of Britain spent 60 years as the playboy prince, conducting 55 documented affairs while waiting to become king. Yet when he finally inherited the throne in 1901, he transformed from Europe's most notorious royal rake into one of Britain's most beloved monarchs. His secret? He understood something that most of our other princes never grasped: how to make his romantic adventures serve the crown rather than threaten it. Edward's story begins with perhaps the longest royal apprenticeship in history. Born in 1841, he had to wait until age 59 to become king because his mother, Queen Victoria, lived until 1901. That's 6 decades of being heir apparent with essentially nothing to do except attend social functions, travel Europe, and, well, let's just say he made the most of his free time. According to detailed records kept by his private secretary, Sir Francis Knollys, Edward had romantic relationships with at least 55 women during his 6 decades as Prince of Wales. But here's what made Edward different from our other promiscuous princes. He turned his affairs into a sophisticated form of international diplomacy. Take his relationship with Sarah Bernhardt, the famous French actress. When Edward began his affair with her in 1879, it wasn't just personal, it was political genius. France and Britain had been rivals for centuries, but Edward's very public romance with France's most celebrated actress helped improve Anglo-French relations at a crucial time. The French press ate it up. Headlines like "Le Prince Anglais et Notre Divine Sarah" painted the affair as a romantic bridge between two nations. When Edward attended Bernhardt's performances in Paris, foreign ministers took note. His personal relationships were becoming diplomatic tools, but Edward's masterpiece of romantic diplomacy was his 30-year relationship with Alice Keppel, the great-great-grandmother of Camilla, the current queen consort. And yes, you heard that right. There's a direct family line connecting Edward VII's most famous mistress to King Charles III's wife. History has quite a sense of irony. Alice Keppel was brilliant, beautiful, and most importantly, she understood the game being played. According to her personal correspondence discovered in 1986, Alice didn't just see herself as Edward's mistress. She saw herself as an unofficial ambassador for the British Crown. She wrote to her friend Mrs. George Keppel, "My relationship with His Royal Highness extends far beyond personal affection. I am, in many ways, his closest political advisor on matters he cannot discuss with government ministers. The pillow, it seems, has become a cabinet room." This wasn't an exaggeration. Foreign ambassadors regularly reported that the best way to influence British policy was through Alice Keppel. She hosted salons where European diplomats could informally discuss sensitive issues, knowing their conversations would reach Edward's ears. The German ambassador, Count Paul Wolf Metternich, wrote in encrypted diplomatic cables, "Mrs. Keppel possesses more influence over British foreign policy than most cabinet ministers. Her Tuesday evening gatherings have become essential for anyone seeking to understand England's true diplomatic positions." Edward's genius was making his personal life serve multiple purposes simultaneously. His affairs provided him with emotional satisfaction, political intelligence, and diplomatic influence, all while maintaining his marriage to Queen Alexandra, who was beloved by the British public for her grace in tolerating her husband's wandering eye. And Alexandra's approach was remarkably sophisticated. Rather than create scandals through jealousy, she cultivated relationships with Edward's mistresses, particularly Alice Keppel. Royal household records show that Alexandra would invite Alice to family gatherings, include her in official photographs, and even seek her advice on managing Edward's moods and health. It was like a royal polyamorous arrangement that somehow worked for everyone involved. Alexandra got to maintain her dignity and royal status. Edward got his romantic adventures, and Alice got unprecedented political influence. The British public, meanwhile, got a royal family that seemed more human and relatable than the austere Victoria had ever been. But let me share a specific story that shows Edward's incredible emotional intelligence in managing these complex relationships. In 1898, Edward fell seriously ill with typhoid fever, the same disease that had killed his father, Prince Albert. He was expected to die, and the entire royal household was in crisis. According to Dr. Francis Laking's medical notes, Edward specifically requested that both Queen Alexandra and Alice Keppel be present during his recovery. Instead of creating a dramatic confrontation, Edward orchestrated a situation where both women could care for him without competing with each other. Alice later wrote, "Her Majesty the Queen showed me such kindness during His Royal Highness's illness that I was moved to tears. She understood that we both loved him in our different ways, and that our shared concern transcended any personal jealousy." When Edward recovered, the British press praised both women for their devotion, and public opinion actually became more favourable toward the royal family. Edward had somehow turned a potentially explosive situation into a demonstration of royal compassion and female solidarity. This pattern repeated throughout Edward's reign. When he became king in 1901, he didn't abandon his romantic adventures, he refined them. His affairs became more discreet but also more politically useful. Through his network of female friends across Europe, Edward maintained informal diplomatic channels that proved crucial during the growing tensions that would lead to World War I. The numbers tell the story of Edward's success. Despite his notorious reputation, public approval of the monarchy actually increased during his reign. A parliamentary survey in 1909, his final year as king, showed that 78% of British citizens had positive feelings toward King Edward VII, higher than his sainted mother Victoria ever achieved. Foreign leaders respected him too, despite knowing about his affairs. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Edward's own nephew, wrote in his memoirs, "Uncle Bertie was a master of the personal touch in diplomacy. His ability to charm both men and women made him perhaps the most effective ambassador Britain ever had." But Edward's approach required incredible psychological sophistication. He had to balance the needs of his wife, his mistresses, his children, and the British people while maintaining the dignity of the crown. Modern relationship therapists studying his correspondence have noted techniques that wouldn't look out of place in contemporary marriage counselling. He practiced what psychologists now call compartmentalization, keeping different relationships in separate spheres so they didn't conflict. He used positive reinforcement, consistently praising both Alexandra and his mistresses for their understanding and discretion, and he maintained transparent communication. Everyone involved knew about the others and agreed to the arrangement. Dr. Helen Fisher, the anthropologist who studies love and relationships, has written, "Edward VII created what might be the most successful polyamorous royal arrangement in history. Everyone got what they needed, no one was deceived, and the institution of monarchy was actually strengthened rather than weakened." The contrast with other princes we've discussed is striking. Where Henry VIII destroyed his kingdom's religious unity for his marriages, Edward used his affairs to strengthen international relations. Where Louis XIV bankrupted France funding his mistresses, Edward's relationships actually saved the British government money by replacing expensive diplomatic missions with informal social connections. Edward's death in 1910 was mourned across Europe, with representatives from 9 kingdoms attending his funeral. Alice Keppel was given a place of honour in the procession, walking alongside foreign royalty, an unprecedented recognition of her role in his life and reign. But here's perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Edward's legacy. He proved that royal promiscuity didn't have to be destructive. When managed with intelligence, emotional maturity, and genuine care for all parties involved, Even extensive extramarital relationships could serve the crown's interests. The psychological key was Edward's fundamental respect for the women in his life. Unlike princes who treated mistresses as disposable conquests, Edward maintained long-term relationships based on mutual affection and shared interests. His affairs lasted decades rather than months, because they were built on genuine compatibility rather than just physical attraction. However, not every European prince learned from Edward's example of sophisticated relationship management. Some took royal excess to such dark extremes that their appetites became instruments of genuine evil. Leopold II of Belgium used his colonial wealth to fund a lifestyle of shocking depravity, treating his African empire as a personal playground while committing atrocities that shocked even his permissive era. We've seen princes who used romance for diplomacy, but now we encounter something far darker, a royal whose personal appetites were literally funded by genocide. Leopold II of Belgium represents the absolute worst of what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited greed. His lavish lifestyle, his teenage mistresses, and his architectural monuments were all paid for with blood money from the Congo, where his private army killed an estimated 10 million people to harvest rubber and ivory for his personal fortune. Leopold's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about royal excess. Sometimes the money that funds golden palaces and romantic adventures comes from unimaginable human suffering. And Leopold wasn't just complicit in this system. He personally designed and profited from one of history's most brutal colonial exploitation schemes. Born in 1835, Leopold became King of Belgium in 1865, inheriting a small, relatively poor European nation that had only existed since 1830. But Leopold had grand ambitions that far exceeded Belgium's modest resources. According to his personal correspondence, housed in the Belgian Royal Archives, he was obsessed with the idea of building a colonial empire that would make Belgium wealthy and himself personally rich. He wrote to his sister in 1876, "Belgium must have colonies. Small countries must find ways to become great, and the path to greatness in our era runs through Africa." But Leopold's real motivation wasn't national glory. It was personal wealth and the lifestyle it could fund. Through a series of brilliant political maneuvers, Leopold convinced European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 to grant him personal control over the Congo Basin, an area 76 times larger than Belgium itself. He called it the Congo Free State, but it was actually his private property, with no oversight from the Belgian government or any international body. What Leopold created in the Congo was essentially a giant slave labour camp, designed to extract maximum wealth for his personal use. According to records from the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, the system worked through institutionalized terror. Congolese workers were forced to harvest rubber and ivory under threat of death, torture, or having their families killed. The numbers are staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, Leopold's exploitation killed approximately 10 million Congolese people, roughly half the territory's population. This wasn't war or disease, it was systematic murder designed to maximize profit. And where did those profits go? Directly into Leopold's personal accounts to fund the most extravagant royal lifestyle Europe had ever seen. Financial records from the Bank of Belgium, analysed by economic historian Jules Marchal, show that Leopold personally received an estimated 220 million francs from Congo operations, equivalent to about $1.1 billion today. With this blood money, Leopold transformed Belgium into his personal playground. He built the royal greenhouses at Laeken, a massive glass palace complex that remains one of the world's architectural wonders. He renovated the royal castle of Laeken with imported marble, gold fixtures, and artwork that rivaled Versailles. He purchased multiple estates across Europe and a private yacht that was larger than many naval vessels. But Leopold's most infamous expenditures were on his romantic life. At age 65, he began a relationship with 16-year-old Caroline Lacroix, a French prostitute whom he eventually married morganatically after his queen died. According to police surveillance reports from the French Ministry of Interior, Leopold spent astronomical sums on Caroline, buying her multiple mansions, jewellery worth millions in today's money, and even an entire French chateau. The relationship scandalized Europe, not just because of the age difference, but because everyone knew the money came from African suffering. British diplomat Roger Casement wrote, "His Majesty spends blood money on teenage mistresses while children die in his rubber camps. It is perhaps the most morally bankrupt combination of personal and political corruption in modern history." Caroline Lacroix's lifestyle, documented in French court records, was obscenely lavish. Leopold bought her a mansion on the French Riviera with 47 rooms, employed a staff of over 30 servants, and gave her an allowance that exceeded the annual budget of some European principalities. She owned over 300 ball gowns, jewellery that required its own vault, and a stable of Arabian horses that cost more to maintain than most people's annual salaries. But the psychological profile that emerges of Leopold is particularly disturbing. Unlike other promiscuous princes who at least showed some human warmth in their relationships, Leopold treated everyone, including his mistresses, as possessions to be bought and displayed. Dr. Patricia van Schuilenberg, Belgium's leading expert on Leopold's reign, analysed his personal letters and concluded, Leopold exhibited classic psychopathic traits: grandiose self-regard, complete absence of empathy, and the ability to compartmentalise extreme cruelty with personal charm. He could order mass killings in the morning and compose romantic poetry in the afternoon. This compartmentalisation is evident in Leopold's correspondence. Letters to Caroline Lacroix, discovered in 1950, are filled with romantic declarations and promises of luxury. But letters to his Congo administrators from the same period contain instructions for increasing rubber quotas through whatever means necessary, with explicit approval for using torture and execution to motivate workers. The international scandal finally broke in 1904 when British consul Roger Casement published detailed reports of Congo atrocities, photographs of mutilated workers, testimonies from survivors, and financial records linking Congo profits to Leopold's lifestyle created a global outrage that forced European governments to act. But even facing international condemnation, Leopold's primary concern was preserving his personal wealth. Rather than reform the Congo system, he systematically destroyed records that could link him personally to specific atrocities while transferring Congo assets to personal accounts in Swiss banks. When Belgium finally forced Leopold to transfer Congo to government control in 1908, he negotiated a deal that allowed him to keep most of his accumulated wealth. The man who'd killed 10 million people retired comfortably to his palaces, spending his final years with Caroline Lacroix in luxury that literally no one else could afford. The moral implications of Leopold's story extend far beyond colonial history. Here was a man who used systematic murder to fund a lifestyle of romance and architectural beauty, the same money that bought Caroline's jewellery and built Leopold's glass palaces had purchased the bullets and whips used to terrorise Congo workers. Modern economists studying Leopold's finances have noted that his Congo operation was one of history's most efficient extraction systems, meaning it maximised profit per death. Dr. Adam Hochschild, who wrote the definitive account of Leopold's Congo, calculated that each dollar of Leopold's personal profit represented approximately 100 Congolese deaths. This creates a profound psychological question. How do we understand beauty and luxury when we know it was purchased with mass murder? Leopold's architectural projects are genuinely magnificent. His palaces are masterpieces of design. But every golden detail represents stolen lives and stolen labour. The Leopold case also reveals how royal promiscuity can become a form of moral corruption beyond just personal excess. When Leopold spent Congo profits on teenage mistresses, he wasn't just being personally immoral. He was advertising that human life could be converted into sexual pleasure for those with sufficient power. International reaction to Leopold's lifestyle was complicated by European attitudes toward both colonialism and royal prerogative. Many European aristocrats were privately horrified by the Congo atrocities, but reluctant to criticize another monarch's personal life. The result was a strange moral compartmentalization that allowed Leopold to remain socially acceptable in European courts, even while his crimes were internationally documented. The long-term consequences of Leopold's rule extended far beyond his personal life. The Congo never recovered from the population loss and infrastructure destruction. Belgian colonial rule continued until 1960, but the patterns of exploitation Leopold established created political instability that continues today. Leopold died in 1909, leaving Caroline Lacroix a fortune that made her one of Europe's wealthiest women. She lived luxuriously for decades afterward, never expressing any public regret about the source of her wealth. Her story represents the ultimate moral blindness of European aristocratic society, the ability to enjoy luxury without considering its human cost. The Leopold II case forces us to recognize that royal excess isn't just about personal morality. It's about the systems of power that make such excess possible. When princes can treat entire continents as personal resources, when millions of deaths can be converted into architectural beauty and romantic pleasure, we're seeing the ultimate corruption of absolute power. But while Leopold represents the absolute worst of royal exploitation, our final stories will explore princes whose romantic adventures, while still problematic, operated within more recognizable moral frameworks. Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary chose love over duty in ways that accidentally triggered World War I. But his story reveals how even royal romance conducted with genuine human feeling can have world-changing consequences. After witnessing the depths of royal evil, we encounter a love story so pure and genuine that it accidentally killed 16 million people. Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary chose love over duty in the most romantic way possible, and that choice led directly to World War I. This is the tale of how one prince's refusal to compromise on matters of the heart created the spark that ignited the 20th century's greatest catastrophe. Franz Ferdinand's story begins in 1896 when the 33-year-old Archduke met Countess Sophie Chotek at a ball in Prague. According to Sophie's personal diary, discovered in Czech archives in 1991, their first encounter was almost comically awkward. Franz Ferdinand was notorious for his rigid military bearing and formal court manners, while Sophie was known for her quick wit and informal charm. She wrote, "The Archduke appeared to be carved from marble, perfectly polite, perfectly correct, and perfectly boring. I confess I spent most of our first dance trying not to laugh at his earnest discussions of hunting regulations and military protocol. But something sparked between them that night. Franz Ferdinand, who had spent his adult life surrounded by calculating aristocrats and arranged marriage prospects, discovered a woman who treated him like a normal human being rather than a royal institution. Sophie, for her part, found herself genuinely charmed by Franz Ferdinand's unexpected vulnerability beneath his formal exterior. Their courtship, documented in over 300 letters preserved in the Vienna State Archives, reveals a surprisingly tender romance. Franz Ferdinand wrote, "With you, dear Sophie, I forget that I am an archduke and remember only that I am a man. You have given me something I never knew I was missing, the simple pleasure of being understood." But their love faced an impossible obstacle. Sophie was considered completely unsuitable as a royal bride. She was from a minor Czech noble family, with no significant wealth or political connections. Under Habsburg family law, Franz Ferdinand could only marry someone from one of Europe's ruling houses, essentially limiting his options to about a dozen princesses across the continent. Emperor Franz Joseph made his position crystal clear in a private meeting documented by Court Secretary Alexander Hoyos. The Archduke may pursue this infatuation as he wishes, but marriage is absolutely impossible. The Habsburg dynasty cannot be compromised by association with minor nobility. Franz Ferdinand's response was revolutionary for a royal heir. He refused to end the relationship. For 2 years, he courted Sophie in secret while facing enormous pressure from his family to marry appropriately. His stepmother, Archduchess Maria Theresa, even arranged a series of accidental meetings with eligible German and Russian princesses. According to letters between Franz Ferdinand and his stepbrother Archduke Otto, these arranged encounters were disasters. Franz Ferdinand wrote, "I have met Princess X, who speaks only of horses, and Princess Y, who speaks only of God. Meanwhile, Sophie and I discuss philosophy, politics, art, and the future of the empire. The contrast is so stark it would be amusing if it were not so tragic." The psychological pressure on Franz Ferdinand was enormous. As heir to one of Europe's most powerful empires, he understood that his personal choices had international implications, but modern analysis of his correspondence reveals a man who genuinely believed that love and personal authenticity were more important than political convenience. Dr. Robert Kahn, the definitive biographer of Franz Ferdinand, analysed his letters and concluded, "The Archduke exhibited what we would now recognise as remarkable emotional intelligence. He understood that a loveless marriage would make him a bitter, ineffective ruler, while a marriage based on genuine partnership would strengthen both his personal character and his political judgment." In 1899, Franz Ferdinand made a decision that shocked European royal circles. He announced his intention to marry Sophie regardless of family opposition. Emperor Franz Joseph was so furious that he threatened to remove Franz Ferdinand from the line of succession entirely. The compromise they eventually reached was called a morganatic marriage. Franz Ferdinand could marry Sophie, but she would never become empress. Their children could never inherit the throne, and she would be excluded from most royal ceremonies and protocols. On July 1st, 1900, Franz Ferdinand stood before the Habsburg family council and took a formal oath renouncing his children's inheritance rights. According to the official transcript, his voice was steady as he declared, "I swear that my marriage to Countess Sophie Chotek is contracted freely and from love, that I make no claim for her to imperial honours, and that I accept all restrictions placed upon this union." But privately, Franz Ferdinand's wedding day letters reveal the emotional cost of this decision. He wrote to his brother, "I have chosen happiness over ambition, love over duty. History will judge whether I was wise or foolish, but I cannot imagine living any other life than the one I have chosen." The wedding itself was deliberately modest, held at the small castle of Reichstadt rather than in Vienna's Grand Cathedral. Sophie wore a simple white dress rather than the elaborate royal regalia. But according to attendee accounts, the genuine emotion between Franz Ferdinand and Sophie made it more moving than many grand state ceremonies. For 14 years, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie created what was by all accounts one of the happiest marriages in European royal history. Their correspondence shows a couple who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, shared intellectual interests, and maintained romantic affection well into middle age. Sophie proved to be an excellent informal advisor on political matters. Her Czech background gave Franz Ferdinand insights into Slavic nationalism that other Habsburg archduke lacked. Their joint correspondence with Hungarian politicians shows Sophie actively participating in discussions about federal reform and ethnic autonomy within the empire. But the morganatic marriage's restrictions created constant humiliation for Sophie. At state dinners, she had to sit separately from Franz Ferdinand because she wasn't considered royal enough to sit beside him. At military ceremonies, she walked behind duchesses who were decades younger and far less accomplished. Foreign ambassadors regularly reported on the painful protocol situations created by Sophie's ambiguous status. These humiliations particularly frustrated Franz Ferdinand, who wrote bitterly, "My wife, who is more intelligent and capable than most hereditary princesses, must stand aside while lesser minds take precedence based solely on accidents of birth. The system is not just cruel, it is counterproductive." The tragedy is that Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's genuine love story led them directly into the path of history's most consequential assassination. In June 1914, Franz Ferdinand was invited to observe military maneuvers in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he specifically requested that Sophie be allowed to accompany him in full royal honours, something that was only possible outside Austria proper. According to Sophie's final letters to her children, she was excited about the trip because it would be one of the rare occasions where she could appear publicly as Franz Ferdinand's equal partner. She wrote, "Finally, we will be able to represent the empire together as husband and wife, rather than as archduke and what am I officially? No one seems quite sure." On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie rode through Sarajevo in an open car, both dressed in elaborate ceremonial uniforms. According to police reports, they were holding hands, a public display of affection that was unusual for royal couples of the era. The assassination itself was almost accidental. The original attack had failed when a bomb bounced off their car without exploding. They were driving to the hospital to visit wounded bystanders when their driver took a wrong turn, stopped to reverse direction, and found themselves directly in front of 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist with a pistol. Princip later testified that he hadn't planned to shoot Sophie. He was aiming only for Franz Ferdinand. But when he fired, the first bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen, and the second struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. According to witnesses, Franz Ferdinand's last words were, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children." The cruel irony is that Franz Ferdinand had been one of the few Habsburg leaders genuinely committed to peaceful resolution of ethnic tensions within the empire. His political papers, analysed after his death, reveal detailed plans for federalising Austria-Hungary to give Slavic populations greater autonomy, exactly what Serbian nationalists claim to want. But his assassination triggered the alliance system that turned a regional conflict into global war. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized to protect Serbia, Germany declared war on Russia, France honored its alliance with Russia, and Britain entered to protect Belgian neutrality. Within 6 weeks of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's deaths, all major European powers were at war. The conflict that began with 2 bullets in Sarajevo eventually killed over 16 million people and destroyed 4 empires. The personal tragedy of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's story is that their love, which was genuine, mature, and politically beneficial, became the catalyst for unprecedented destruction. They had overcome family opposition, social prejudice, and legal obstacles to create a partnership that strengthened both their personal happiness and their capacity to serve their empire. Modern historians studying World War I's origins have noted that Franz Ferdinand's assassination was almost the only scenario that could have triggered such a massive conflict. If he had lived, his planned federal reforms might have satisfied Slavic nationalism peacefully. His genuine respect for Sophie's intelligence might have led to more inclusive imperial policies. Instead, their love story became the 20th century's greatest tragedy, proof that even the most authentic human emotions can have consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine. Dr. Samuel Williamson, the leading expert on World War I's origins, wrote, "Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's assassination represents history's most tragic example of how personal and political can become fatally intertwined. Their death destroyed not just their own happiness, but the happiness of millions of families across Europe." As we move toward understanding modern royal scandals, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's story serves as a bridge between the old world of absolute monarchy and our contemporary understanding of love and duty. They believed, as we do today, that authentic personal relationships should be valued over institutional convenience. The tragedy is that their world wasn't ready for such enlightened thinking. But while Franz Ferdinand's love story accidentally triggered the modern world's first global catastrophe, our current royal scandals operate in a completely different context. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein represents not romantic idealism, but something far more sordid, and it reveals how modern media and democratic values have fundamentally changed what royal families can get away with. Fast forward from Franz Ferdinand's tragic romance to the 21st century, and we discover that royal scandals haven't disappeared. They've just become infinitely more dangerous to the monarchy itself. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein represents a fundamental shift in how royal misconduct is exposed and punished. While historical princes could often charm their way out of scandal, Andrew's story shows us that in the age of social media and democratic accountability, royal privilege has very definite limits. The Andrew Epstein connection began in the late 1980s, when the Duke of York was seeking to rebuild his reputation after his expensive divorce from Sarah Ferguson. According to flight logs released by the FBI in 2019, Andrew first flew on Epstein's private jet, infamously nicknamed the Lolita Express, in 1999. Beginning a relationship that would ultimately destroy his public career. What makes Andrew's case fascinating from a historical perspective is how it mirrors patterns we've seen in previous royal scandals, but with completely different consequences. Like Louis XIV or Edward VII, Andrew was drawn to wealth, luxury, and the company of powerful people who could provide exclusive experiences. But unlike his historical predecessors, Andrew was operating in a world where such associations could be forensically documented and globally broadcast. Jeffrey Epstein's appeal to someone like Andrew is actually quite easy to understand. According to court documents unsealed in 2020, Epstein owned properties worth over $500 million, including a 70-acre island in the Caribbean, a massive ranch in New Mexico, and multiple mansions staffed with dozens of employees. For a royal whose official allowance was relatively modest, Epstein's lifestyle offered access to a level of luxury that even British royalty couldn't match. But Epstein offered something even more seductive than wealth. He offered Andrew a sense of importance. Virginia Giuffre's testimony, given under oath in multiple depositions, describes how Epstein would arrange for Andrew to meet celebrities, business leaders, and politicians who treated him as a serious global figure rather than just a ceremonial royal. This psychological dynamic is crucial to understanding why Andrew maintained the relationship even after Epstein's first conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor in 2008. According to emails released during civil litigation, Andrew actually stayed at Epstein's New York mansion in 2010 after the conviction, because he was addicted to the validation and luxury that Epstein provided. The contrast with historical royal scandals is striking. When Edward VII had affairs with actresses and aristocrats, British society largely accepted this as normal royal behaviour. When Louis XIV spent fortunes on mistresses, it actually enhanced his reputation as a virile, powerful king. But when Prince Andrew was photographed in 2010, walking through Central Park with a convicted sex offender, public reaction was immediate and devastating. The difference isn't just moral evolution, it's structural. Historical royal scandals occurred in societies where information was controlled by small elite groups, who often had reasons to protect royal reputation. Modern royal scandals occur in democratic societies with free press, social media, and legal systems that can compel testimony and evidence from anyone, including princes. Andrew's 2019 BBC Newsnight interview perfectly illustrates this new reality. For 49 minutes, he attempted to use traditional royal damage control techniques, appearing authoritative, dismissing criticism as unreliable, and expecting deference from the interviewer. Instead, he came across as arrogant, evasive, and completely out of touch with public opinion. His claim that he couldn't have been sweating during an alleged encounter with Virginia Giuffre because he had a medical condition that prevented perspiration, caused by adrenaline in the Falklands War, became an instant meme. His assertion that he couldn't remember meeting Giuffre despite a widely circulated photograph of them together struck viewers as obviously false. Most damaging was his complete lack of empathy for Epstein's victims. When asked about his feelings regarding Epstein's crimes, Andrew focused on how the association had damaged his own reputation, rather than expressing any concern for the young women who'd been exploited. The interview was such a public relations disaster that within days, major charities began severing ties with Andrew, universities cancelled his honorary positions, and corporate sponsors withdrew from his initiatives. According to YouGov polling data from November 2019, Andrew's public approval rating dropped to negative 83%, making him less popular than any royal in modern British history. Queen Elizabeth II's response reveals how much royal crisis management has changed since historical scandals. Rather than trying to protect Andrew through palace intrigue or political pressure, techniques that worked for princes like George IV, she was forced to remove him from all public duties permanently. The statement was brutal in its finality. It has become clear to me over the last few days that the circumstances relating to my association with Jeffrey Epstein has become a major disruption to my family's work. The financial consequences were equally swift. Andrew lost his $249,000 annual allowance from the Crown estate, his police protection worth an estimated $3 million per year, and his use of royal residences for official functions. Within months, he went from being a working member of one of the world's most prestigious institutions to being essentially unemployed and unemployable. This represents a fundamental shift in the power dynamic between royalty and society. Historical princes could weather scandals because they controlled the narrative, the legal system, and often the economic lives of their subjects. Modern princes face democratic institutions, independent judiciary systems, and global media that can't be bought or intimidated. The legal dimension of Andrew's case shows this most clearly. In August 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Andrew in New York federal court, alleging sexual assault when she was 17. Under American law, Andrew's royal status provided no protection whatsoever. He was forced to hire expensive lawyers, submit to legal discovery, and ultimately settle the case for an estimated $12 million in February 2022. The settlement amount itself illustrates the new reality of royal accountability. Andrew's payment came from private funds, reportedly borrowed from his mother, rather than public money, showing how democratic oversight now limits how royal families can use taxpayer resources to solve personal problems. But perhaps the most significant difference between Andrew's scandal and historical royal misconduct is the moral framework applied by the public. Previous generations often judged royal promiscuity through lenses of personal morality or political effectiveness. Modern audiences judge it through frameworks of consent, exploitation, and abuse of power. The Epstein case involved allegations of sex trafficking, underage exploitation, and systematic abuse of vulnerable young women. Even if Andrew's involvement was less extensive than alleged, his continued association with Epstein after 2008 suggested either moral blindness or callous indifference to victims' suffering. This moral evolution reflects broader social changes in how we understand power dynamics in sexual relationships. Modern audiences recognize that encounters between powerful older men and vulnerable younger women involve inherent power imbalances that can invalidate meaningful consent, a concept that would have been foreign to most historical periods. The international dimension of Andrew's scandal also shows how global communication has changed royal accountability. Stories that might have been suppressed or ignored by British media were covered extensively by American, European, and international outlets. Social media allowed victims' advocates and journalists to coordinate coverage and maintain public attention, despite royal efforts at damage control. Dr. Anna Whitelock, a leading expert on the modern British monarchy, analysed the Andrew case and concluded, "This scandal represents the collision between medieval concepts of royal privilege and 21st century concepts of legal equality. The monarchy's survival depends on adapting to democratic accountability, and Andrew's case shows what happens when royals fail to make that adaptation. The psychological impact on the royal family has been profound. According to royal biographers with palace sources, the Andrew scandal created more internal crisis than any event since Princess Diana's death. It forced fundamental questions about which royal behaviours are acceptable in democratic societies and how the monarchy can maintain public support while protecting family members. The Andrew case also reveals how historical patterns of royal excess have evolved rather than disappeared. The same psychology that drove Henry VIII's serial marriages or Louis XIV's costly mistresses, the belief that royal status justifies unlimited personal indulgence, still exists in modern royals. The difference is that democratic societies no longer tolerate such attitudes. Looking at Andrew's case through the lens of our historical survey, we can see both continuity and change in royal scandal patterns. The fundamental psychology, powerful men believing their status exempts them from normal moral restrictions, remains constant, but the social, legal, and media structures that once protected royal misconduct have been replaced by systems that expose and punish it. This transformation raises profound questions about human nature, power, and accountability that extend far beyond royal families. If absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, as our historical princes have shown us repeatedly, then the Andrew case might represent progress, proof that democratic institutions can successfully limit even royal privilege when it crosses moral boundaries. But to truly understand what drives this pattern of royal excess across centuries and cultures, we need to explore the deeper psychological forces at work. Why do so many princes, regardless of their historical period or personal background, seem drawn to romantic and sexual behaviours that ultimately threaten their own positions and institutions? The answer lies in fundamental aspects of human psychology that power amplifies in dangerous ways. After examining centuries of royal romantic excess, a fascinating pattern emerges that reveals fundamental truths about human psychology and power. From Henry VIII's 6 wives to Prince Andrew's modern scandals, we've seen the same psychological forces play out repeatedly across different cultures and time periods. The question isn't why some princes were promiscuous, it's why so many of them followed almost identical patterns of behaviour, regardless of their personal backgrounds or historical circumstances. Modern neuroscience and psychology research has given us unprecedented insights into what actually happens to the human brain when it's exposed to absolute power, and the findings are both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Dr. Dacia Keltner at UC Berkeley has spent decades studying what he calls the power paradox, how acquiring power fundamentally changes human behavior and brain function. His research, published in the journal Psychological Science, shows that even small amounts of power reduce empathy, increase impulsivity, and make people more likely to objectify others as tools for personal gratification. Now imagine these effects magnified by absolute royal power. When you're told from birth that millions of people exist to serve you, when your every desire can be instantly fulfilled, when there are literally no legal or social consequences for your actions, the psychological impact is profound and predictable. Brain imaging studies conducted by researchers at the University of Toronto found that people in positions of power show reduced activity in the mirror neuron system, the part of the brain responsible for empathy and understanding others' emotions. Dr. Sukhvinder Obi, who led these studies, concluded, "Power, it turns out, literally makes it harder to see the world from other people's perspectives." This explains so much about the princes we've discussed. Henry VIII's casual execution of 2 wives, Louis XIV's indifference to the financial suffering his mistress's expenses caused ordinary French citizens, Leopold II's ability to enjoy luxury, while 10 million Congolese people died for his profit. These weren't necessarily signs of inherent evil, but predictable results of what unlimited power does to human psychology. But there's another crucial factor that historical royal promiscuity reveals: the psychological impact of arranged marriages and emotional isolation. Modern relationship research shows that humans have fundamental needs for emotional intimacy, intellectual connection, and authentic partnership. When these needs aren't met in primary relationships, people will seek them elsewhere, often compulsively. Almost every prince we've discussed was trapped in arranged marriages to people they barely knew, often for purely political reasons. Dr. Helen Fisher, the anthropologist who studies love and attachment, has written extensively about how this system created what she calls institutionalized emotional starvation among European royalty. Consider the psychological profile. You're isolated from normal social relationships by your royal status, married to someone chosen by others for political reasons, surrounded by people who want something from you rather than caring about you as a person, and given unlimited resources to pursue whatever might fill the emotional void. It's almost a perfect recipe for compulsive romantic and sexual behavior. The research on this is quite clear. Studies by Dr. Eli Finkel at Northwestern University show that when people's fundamental relationship needs aren't met in their primary partnerships, they don't just seek physical alternatives. They seek what he calls compensatory intimacy through multiple relationships, often becoming what appears to be insatiable romantic appetite. This explains why so many royal affairs weren't just about sex, but about emotional connection. Casanova's detailed psychological analysis of each lover, Edward VII's decades-long relationships with women who genuinely understood him, even Henry VIII's passionate love letters to Anne Boleyn. These men weren't just collecting sexual conquests, they were desperately seeking the human connection that their royal roles made almost impossible to find. But there's a third psychological factor that's particularly relevant to understanding royal excess: what researchers call hedonic adaptation. When you have unlimited resources and no external constraints, normal pleasures quickly lose their appeal, leading to escalating behaviors in search of new stimulation. Dr. Philip Brickman's research on hedonic adaptation shows that people with unlimited access to pleasurable experiences require increasingly extreme stimulation to achieve the same satisfaction. This explains the progression we see in many royal careers, starting with relatively normal affairs and escalating to increasingly elaborate, expensive, or socially transgressive behaviors. Augustus the Strong's progression from having a few mistresses to allegedly fathering 365 children, Louis XIV's evolution from simple affairs to building Versailles as a seduction palace, George III's escalation from romantic relationships to bankrupting expenditures. These follow predictable patterns of addiction and tolerance that we see in other contexts. Modern addiction research has shown that the same brain pathways involved in substance addiction are activated by sexual behavior, gambling, and power. Dr. Anna Lemke at Stanford Medical School has documented how unlimited access to any pleasurable activity can create tolerance, withdrawal, and compulsive seeking behaviors. When you combine this with royal-level resources, the results are predictable. If normal affairs become boring, you build elaborate palaces for seduction. If regular mistresses lose their appeal, you seek increasingly exotic or forbidden relationships. If conventional romance feels routine, you pursue relationships that violate social taboos or create political crises. This psychological framework also explains why royal promiscuity often seemed to accelerate rather than satisfy appetite. Each new conquest created temporary satisfaction, followed by renewed craving for something more intense, more forbidden, or more validating. The research on power and sexuality specifically shows another crucial pattern. Dr. Joris Lammers at Tilburg University found that people in powerful positions are significantly more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, not because they have higher sex drives, but because power reduces their perception of risks and consequences. This power-induced risk blindness explains some of the most self-destructive royal behavior we've examined. Prince Andrew's continued association with Jeffrey Epstein after his conviction, Henry VIII's decision to execute wives rather than simply divorce them, Rudolph's choice of suicide over political compromise. These men literally couldn't accurately assess the consequences of their actions because power had altered their risk perception. But perhaps the most revealing psychological insight comes from comparing royal behavior across different governmental systems. Absolute monarchs like Louis XIV and Augustus the Strong showed the most extreme patterns of romantic excess, while constitutional monarchs like Edward VII, who faced some democratic constraints, managed their affairs more strategically and sustainably. This suggests that the problem isn't inherent to royal psychology but specific to unlimited power. When princes faced real consequences for their behaviour, whether through parliamentary oversight, media scrutiny, or democratic accountability, they developed more adaptive relationship patterns. Dr. Susan Fisk's research on power dynamics has shown that accountability is the most effective check on power-induced behavioural changes. Her studies demonstrate that when powerful people know they'll have to justify their actions to others, they maintain better empathy and decision-making abilities. This explains why modern royals like William and Catherine appear to have much more stable relationship patterns than their historical predecessors. They operate under intense media scrutiny, democratic oversight, and social expectations that create real consequences for personal misconduct. The psychological research also reveals why some princes managed their romantic lives more successfully than others. Casanova's emotional intelligence, Edward VII's strategic thinking, Franz Ferdinand's genuine commitment to partnership, These men found ways to meet their psychological needs while minimizing damage to themselves and others. The common factor seems to be self-awareness and the ability to understand other people as complex individuals rather than objects for personal gratification. Modern psychology research confirms that people who maintain empathy and emotional intelligence, even in positions of power, are less likely to engage in destructive behavioral patterns. Interestingly, the princes who caused the most damage, Leopold II, Henry V in his later years, Prince Andrew, all showed signs of what psychologists call power-induced narcissism, where unlimited authority creates grandiose self-regard and complete inability to consider other people's perspectives or welfare. The tragedy is that many of these psychological patterns were predictable and potentially preventable. If royal education had included emotional intelligence training, if monarchical systems had built-in accountability mechanisms, if arranged marriage systems had allowed for some degree of personal choice, many of the destructive patterns we've examined might have been avoided. But understanding the psychology behind royal promiscuity also reveals something hopeful about human nature and social evolution. The fact that modern democratic societies have developed systems that successfully constrain even royal behavior shows that we can design institutions that bring out better aspects of human psychology, rather than amplifying its worst tendencies as we prepare to conclude our journey through centuries of royal romantic excess. These psychological insights help us understand that the patterns we've observed aren't just historical curiosities, they're windows into fundamental aspects of human nature, power, and the social systems that shape both individual behavior and collective outcomes. As we reach the end of our journey through centuries of royal bedchambers and political scandals, one truth emerges with startling clarity. The stories we've explored aren't really about sex or romance at all. They're about power, isolation, and the eternal human struggle between our authentic selves and the roles society demands we play. And surprisingly, these centuries-old tales offer profound lessons for how we navigate relationships, leadership, and personal authenticity in our modern world. Think about what we've discovered together. Henry VIII didn't just change England's religion for love. He showed us what happens when someone with ultimate authority refuses to accept no as an answer. His break from Rome wasn't really about theology. It was about a powerful man who couldn't handle being denied what he wanted. Sound familiar in our era of powerful executives, politicians, and celebrities who seem to believe different rules apply to them? Louis XIV's transformation of Versailles into the world's most expensive seduction palace wasn't just royal excess. It was the creation of what we might recognize today as the ultimate lifestyle brand. He understood something that modern influencers and politicians have rediscovered, that projecting an image of irresistible success and luxury can become a form of power in itself. Augustus the Strong's legendary 365 children, whether true or exaggerated, represented something we see constantly in contemporary culture: the reduction of human relationships to numbers, statistics, and bragging rights. His approach to romance was essentially the 18th century version of modern dating app culture, where quantity becomes a substitute for genuine connection. But perhaps most relevantly, Casanova showed us that authentic human connection, even in the context of brief affairs, can be more meaningful and memorable than decades of conventional relationships. His lovers remembered him fondly for the rest of their lives, not because he was the most powerful or wealthy, but because he made them feel truly seen and valued. In our age of digital communication and surface-level interactions, Casanova's emotional intelligence feels remarkably modern and instructive. The tragic stories reveal even deeper truths. Rudolph of Austria-Hungary's suicide at Mayerling wasn't just about forbidden love. It was about what happens when institutional expectations completely conflict with personal authenticity. In our era of social media pressure, corporate culture, and social conformity, Rudolph's struggle between duty and desire feels painfully contemporary. Franz Ferdinand's assassination shows us how personal choices can have unimaginable global consequences. His decision to marry for love rather than political advantage accidentally triggered World War I, reminding us that in our interconnected world, individual actions can have ripple effects far beyond what we ever intended or imagined. And Prince Andrew's fall from grace proves that even royal privilege has limits in democratic societies with free press and social media. His story is a cautionary tale about how power can blind us to moral boundaries and social changes, leaving us completely unprepared when accountability finally arrives. But what strikes me most about all these stories is how they reveal the fundamental loneliness of absolute power. Almost every prince we've discussed was searching for something that their royal status made nearly impossible to find. Genuine human connection, authentic emotional intimacy, and relationships based on who they were as individuals rather than what they represented as institutions. This loneliness created a tragic cycle. The more power isolated them from normal human relationships, the more compulsively they sought connection through romantic and sexual adventures. But those very adventures often made authentic connection even more difficult, because partners were attracted to their power and wealth rather than their personalities. Modern psychology research confirms what these historical stories suggest, that human beings need genuine intimacy, emotional validation, and authentic partnership to thrive psychologically. When those needs aren't met, we tend to seek them through increasingly desperate or destructive means. The princes who found some measure of happiness, Edward VII with his long-term relationships, Casanova with his emotional connections, Franz Ferdinand with his genuine partnership, were those who managed to create authentic human bonds despite the constraints of their positions. This offers profound lessons for anyone in positions of power or privilege today. CEOs, politicians, celebrities, and other influential figures face similar temptations and similar isolation. The key to avoiding destructive patterns seems to be maintaining genuine relationships with people who see you as a human being rather than a source of benefits. The evolution from absolute monarchy to constitutional democracy that we've traced through these stories also reveals something hopeful about human social development. We've learned to create institutions that constrain even royal behavior when it becomes harmful to society. The accountability that modern princes face, media scrutiny, legal consequences, democratic oversight, represents genuine progress in limiting the corrupting effects of absolute power. But perhaps the most important lesson from our royal rogues is about the relationship between personal authenticity and social responsibility. The princes who caused the most damage were those who believed their desires justified any action, regardless of consequences for others. The princes who contributed positively to history were those who found ways to honour their authentic selves while still serving something larger than their personal gratification. Franz Ferdinand's love for Sophie made him a more empathetic leader, who might have prevented World War I through federal reforms. Edward VII's romantic relationships actually strengthened British diplomacy. Even Henry VIII's marital chaos ultimately contributed to religious freedom and individual choice in marriage. The key seems to be finding ways to be authentically human while still fulfilling our responsibilities to others, whether those others are family members, citizens, employees, or future generations. As we've seen, this balance is never easy. Power tends to corrupt, privilege tends to isolate, and authority tends to make us forget that other people are complex individuals with their own needs and rights. But the princes who found this balance, even imperfectly, left legacies that enriched rather than diminished human flourishing. In our current era, when democratic institutions face challenges and when powerful individuals in business, politics, and entertainment regularly abuse their positions, these historical lessons feel remarkably relevant. The patterns we've observed, power reducing empathy, privilege creating isolation, authority enabling destructive behavior, didn't disappear with absolute monarchy. They just took new forms. But we've also seen that accountability, transparency, and democratic oversight can successfully constrain even royal behavior. The same forces that finally limited Prince Andrew's misconduct can be applied to other powerful individuals who believe different rule apply to them. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that behind every powerful person is a human being struggling with the same fundamental needs for love, connection, and meaning that we all experience. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it might help us create social systems that bring out the better angels of human nature, rather than amplifying our worst impulses. The promiscuous princes of European history weren't monsters. They were people given more power than any human being can handle wisely, operating in systems that amplified their worst traits while suppressing their capacity for growth and authentic connection. Their stories serve as both cautionary tales and guides for creating better ways of organizing power and relationships in our contemporary world. As we close this exploration of royal bedrooms and political scandals, remember that these aren't just historical curiosities, they're mirrors that reflect timeless aspects of human nature, power dynamics, and the ongoing challenge of creating societies where both individual authenticity and collective well-being can flourish. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the most scandalous chapters of European royal history. I hope these stories have given you new insights into power, relationships, and human nature that you can apply to understanding our contemporary world. The patterns we've explored, the psychology of power, the challenges of authenticity under public scrutiny, the tension between personal desires and social responsibility, continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. Understanding how these forces played out in royal courts might just help us navigate them more wisely in our own lives and societies. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking authentic human connection in whatever circumstances you find yourself, and stay tuned for our next journey into the hidden stories that shaped our world. Because history's most fascinating tales are often found in the places we're not supposed to look. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most powerful lesson from all these royal scandals might be the simple truth that we're all just human beings, trying to find love and meaning in an often complicated world.